Welcome to another edition of Curtis Jones Writing. I'm reading every chapter of every book in case you've just now tuned in. And I've written 14 books. I'm on number 4 at this point. And the first two books were called Dad's Old Truck 1 and 2. And it tells the life story of a little boy that lived some very strange things. And I went from 9 years old up to about 17 or 18 years old in those books. And I pick up in after Dad's Old Truck 2, and I follow along with Love Endures All Things. The first book here in a 3 book series is a love story from a teenage marriage to senior years. And uh, it tells about my life story after I got just before I got married up until I got married. And it starts off with accidentally getting into the Navy and uh, I think you'll find it enjoyable. Today's chapter is chapter 9, and the title of this chapter is The Wild Boar. And so I won't give anything about it away because the book describes the background that you need to know anyway. So let's start with this one The Wild Boar, chapter 9. Love endures all things. After many years in California, we returned to Oklahoma. We felt good to be back in those hills again. I had forgotten how much I missed that with its solitude and unspoiled forests. We moved to Mom and Dad's place, and which lay adjacent to the national forest. That forest was untouched, and it was rugged and very wild. My father had bought a place from Uncle John. This place had been in the Johnson family since the early 1940s. It was originally used for farming, but over the last several years, it was left to nature. When Mom and Dad bought the place, they built a large house. It overlooked a valley below. We could see about 10 miles from that peak. It was on the north slope of Workman Mountain. When Stephanie and I came back this time, we stayed with them until we were able to buy an old mobile home. We placed our mobile home across the driveway from their house. It also overlooked the valley below. We put it there because of access to the electric service and to the water lines. We had to clear many shrub oaks and bushes to put the trailer into that spot. The trailer was 55 foot long and about 10 foot wide. When we unhooked the trailer, the front of the trailer was about 5 foot in elevation from the back of the trailer, where it had dropped about 5 foot in elevation. Uh, when we leveled the trailer, the front of the trailer stood 5 foot off of the ground. You could nearly walk under the front of that trailer. We used hydraulic jacks to raise the trailer to that height. It was not an easy job. I bought a pickup loaded with concrete blocks to set the trailer on as we jacked it up. I stacked the blocks into piers every 10 foot along the length of the trailer until it was level. The front of the trailer had 10 blocks in each pier. When we raised it to the point of level, it took us nearly 2 days to level the trailer. We raised it 1 block at a time using wooden spacers on top of the blocks so they would not crack. My father and I worked on different sides of the trailer, stacking blocks from the back to the front. My little brother Henry carried the blocks to us as we needed them. When the trailer was raised as high as it needed to go, it was secured and stable. I was proud of the work we did. Without my father and my brother's help, it may have taken me 2 weeks to level that trailer. It is good to have family. We had lived in mom and dad's house with all three children while we found work and bought the trailer. I'm sure they were just as happy as to see us move to our own place and vacate theirs as we were. The trailer house was only 2 bedrooms. Uh, in the kids' room, we put 2 sets of bunk beds and a dresser. The kids' room was at the back of the trailer. The master bedroom was at the front end of the trailer. The view from our bedroom overlooked the valley. From the top of the hill, nothing impaired our view. It was very nice. We were able to see about 10 miles into the distance where Highway 59 ran up a valley on the edge of Arkansas. I was quite happy to be there. I helped Dad with his farm. On the farm, some jobs require more than one man to accomplish. That's where I helped. Dad had several houses on this little farm, 35-acre place. He was raising colts by the time I moved there. He had several female horses ready to fold. When he needed stud service, I helped him move the horses to the stud. I loved to walk through the woods by myself because I felt like I was restoring my soul. When it was time to check fencing to make sure nothing was broken, I always volunteered. That served two purposes for me. I enjoyed the solitude and that silence from being away from three little children. That also gave me time from uninterrupted contemplation. Sorry about that. One October evening, Dad came over to knock on my door about 11 p.m. He said he heard his mare making noises. This mare was ready to fold. As I walked with him through the thick brush, I began to hear the sound he described. It sounded like the mare was in pain, perhaps having difficulty in birth. As we walked, moving slowly down the narrow path, the sound became louder. I told Dad that I thought it sounded more like a grunt than a horse, or than the noise a horse might make. We had walked several hundred feet when Dad stopped suddenly. There was very little moonlight. We could not see very clearly. I could tell Dad was holding a finger up to his mouth as if to shush me. He was listening intensely. The sound became more acute so that we could clearly tell it was not a horse. In the 70s, this country was very wild, with all kinds of creatures living in the national forest. We realized, we recognized footprints of wolves and coyotes and bobcats and mountain lions. They lived in this area. Many Arkansas Razorback pigs also. They were all very dangerous to humans. Dad looked at me and put his finger to his mouth as if to say shh again. We moved slowly toward the sound of the rustling. By then it had stopped. We had gone over the crest of the hill and were now in a small valley that protected us from the wind. The valley also amplified the noise that we heard. Just about that moment, we heard an unmistakable scream of a mountain lion not more than 30 feet ahead of us. Dad had his 22 caliber rifle with him. I had no gun at all with me. After all, we were looking for a horse that we thought was about to have a colt. Neither Dad nor myself were ready for the sound that pierced our ears on that cold, silent night. By now, a cloud had moved over the thin moon so that it gave almost no light. We had to strain our eyes, turning our flashlight beam to this and that way to see anything. The woods were thick and the brush was tall. Our vision was very limited. Dad's flashlight caught the reflection of the eyes of a big cat. We both saw the glow of those frightening eyes. They seemed to cut through our very hearts with fear. Our courage melted at the sight of those eyes. I believed that if either one of us had been there alone, we would have turned and ran with all our might. But men are funny creatures. We don't want to appear frightened, especially when we are with another man. So Dad and I looked at each other, wondering if the other would run first. If one of us had taken off, the other would surely have followed. I don't know about Dad, but I could feel my heart in my throat. I had heard stories of mountain lions and what they could do to a man. Dad told stories of life in the 30s in the very rugged hills of southeast Oklahoma, and the mountain lions that lived there there were stories about mountain lions digging through the shingle roof of log cabins to get to the fresh meat. Stories about mountain lions tracking small girls and killing them for food. I heard all of these stories. They were told to keep us safe when I was young. When my grandmother told the story of an event when she was a child, the story of the death of her close friend caused by a mountain lion, my grandmother and her friend Gail were both 11 years old. Gail had always been afraid of the dark. Her father decided to teach her that there was nothing she should be afraid of in the night. So one night he sent her out to get a bucket of water from the well. The well was about 100 foot from the house. He asked the little girl to go get a bucket of water. She said she'd rather wait until morning, but the father would not hear of it. He insisted that she go get water that night. The father thought he was helping his daughter learn how to deal with her fear. The young girl picked up the bucket with a great deal of fear in her heart. She slowly walked toward the door. This was about 10 o'clock in the evening on this chilly fall night. The little girl usually would have been asleep by that time. The father had been telling stories of their family history. She had stayed up for the stories. One of the stories had been about an ancestor that had died from a bear attack. Her father knew there were very few bears where they lived. Though they lived in the hills, and there were other creatures that lived there where they did. But the old farmer had never seen tracks of any animals that might injure his daughter. When the wolves were near, his dogs would raise an alarm. But this night there was not a sound from the guard dog. The old farmer was sure that this would be a good way to show his daughter there was nothing to fear from the dark except fear itself. As the frightened young girl went out the door, the father closed it behind her. He put the lock on the door so that she could not get back in. The girl slowly walked by the light of the quarter moon, her ears fine tuned to every sound as she moved toward the well. The father believed she had already gotten to the well, so he relaxed. As she pulled up the bucket of water, a sudden sound, fear overcame her. The next morning, her bucket was found full of water 20 feet from the well, all because all believed that she had set the bucket down because of something she had seen. The old farmer heard the young girl scream, "There was something out here." The old farmer was sure the young girl had imagined that she seen something. He decided he would not open the door. He could hear the young girl running toward the house. He heard her feet hit hard against the boards on the porch. He heard her hands pound on the door. She could not open it because it was locked. The old farmer's heart was breaking from the sound of terror in his young daughter's voice. Still, he would not open the door so that she would learn there was nothing in the dark that could hurt you. The old farmer was sure there was nothing outside except his daughter's fears. If there was anything, the dogs would be raising a ruckus. There was no sound other than his daughter's voice that broke the silence of that fateful night. He thought to himself, "I must be strong, or she will not learn a lesson that will help her through life." So he put his hands over his ears so he could not hear her moan and the sound of great fear in her voice. The old father sat there with his light that dimly shone from the kerosene lamp. It barely lit the room. In perhaps a half a minute, the sound of her screams and cries ceased. He heard no more screams or moans. He thought to himself, "I think she has learned not to be afraid of the dark." He thought she had calmed down and was no longer hysterical. "This has been a hard won battle," he thought to himself. "It is for my daughter's own good that I have put her through this, and one day when she's older, she will thank me for what I have done. Of that I am sure." As he sat there waiting for enough time to pass, she would be convinced of her safety. He noticed how eerily quiet it had seemed to become outside. There was no crickets rubbing their legs together. There were no tree frogs croaking. Even the old owl had quit screeching. He thought how strange it seemed that not a sound reached his ears. He got up from his chair. He picked up his corncob pipe from off the mantel. He turned and was facing the door that he had sent his daughter out moments earlier. But what was this that met his eyes? A liquid running under the door. Is it water? It looks dark. Could it be that my daughter has spilled the water out of the bucket? He thought she was not usually clumsy, but something was running under the door. At that moment, his mind moved to the unthinkable. That might not be water running under the door. He dropped his corncob pipe. It hit the rocks that lined the hearth in front of the fireplace. Just as the pipe had broken on the hearth, his heart also began to break. Could this be the life's blood of my daughter running under the door? He didn't think about the broken pipe or the life lesson he intended to teach his dear daughter. He raced toward the door, breathless. He grabbed the door and jerked it open, and it would not move. He had injured his hand because he had jerked with such strength. He realized the lock was still attached to the door. So he unlocked the door. He jerked the door with such force that it slammed against the wall. On the boards of the porch was a great pool of blood and scratch marks on the outside of the door. Differently, different scratch marks on the floor of the porch. His daughter was not there. Only the blood remained. He raised his eyes to search the horizon in all directions. He hoped he might see that beautiful face again. She was not there. He cried with a loud, mournful voice for his daughter to come home. With a shrieking, tearful voice, he yelled, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." He ran to the well. All he found was the bucket of water. So he ran to the fence. Then he ran to the barn. Then he ran back home. She was nowhere to be found. He did not know what to do. He had put her in peril. Now she had disappeared from the living. The old man fell to the ground with his face lying in his arms. He cried the whole night long. As day began to break, the old man got to his feet and walked toward the house, seeing the bucket sitting near the well, still full of water. The tears in his eyes made it so difficult to see. When he got to the porch, there was a trail of blood that led off the porch in the direction of the forest. The old man went to the house and took his muzzle loader from over the fireplace. He took the shot and the powder horn. He laid across his shoulder and started toward the woods where the trail had led. He knew that his daughter had been dragged away by a great predator. He recognized the tracks of a big cat. He realized why his dog had not made any noise. The evidence said that the panther had been on top of the house when he sent his daughter outside to fetch water. He wanted to teach her a lesson about fear. The old man realized that he, through his own actions, had killed his daughter. He followed the tracks not a quarter mile into the woods when he found what was left of his offspring. They said he was never the same after that dreadful night. My grandmother was a my grandmother was a best friend to this young girl. She told my father the story many times, for you see, they lived in the same area where my father grew up. I had heard the story from my father many times as well. It helped us to know things we should avoid and what we should not do. The story was in the back of my mind as I heard the second grunt, almost as though the beast was upon us. Dad and I began to slowly back away from the beast and the sound that it made. I quickly got behind Dad and said, You've got the gun, so I'll go behind you. We both slowly backed up the hill, looking ahead and left and right as quickly as we could. We would not be surprised by the creature approaching. We heard two or three more small growls out of the creature as we backed away. The noise it made became more faint as we traveled away from us, as it traveled away from us. There was a great sigh of relief from both of us. They tell me that creatures like this are as afraid of us as we are of them. I don't believe that in this mountain lion. This mountain lion was afraid of me as much as I was of it. I don't think so. As we entered Dad's house, he put his gun away. We sat down at the table and looked at each other. I don't know just how pale I may have looked, but it was enough that Dad mentioned it. Dad was really quite dark from all the work that he had done outside, but even his face was a little pale as well. As we sat there at the kitchen table, Dad heard my heels hitting the floor in rapid clicks. As my heels struck the surface of the kitchen floor, I had not even noticed it because my senses were still acute. I guess I was still listening for that big cat. As I calmed down from the intense encounter with the uninvited guest, my breathing also slowed down. We both had a laugh as a way of reassuring each other that we're okay. I went home and told Stephanie all that had happened, that I had experienced that evening, how we thought we might have been stalked by a mountain lion. This was not the first time I had been stalked by one of those big cats. It happened 2 years earlier, but this tale is about a wild boar, isn't it? Soon spring arrived, and I was up to my neck in cabin fever. I truly enjoyed going out to the and walking in the woods. I usually carried a 22 rifle in case I saw a rabbit or a squirrel, but on this day I only carried my pistol strapped to my hip. I brought this pistol I bought this pistol after the mountain lion event with Dad that winter. Well, this fine Saturday morning, I strapped on my holster, got the pistol, and put it on my hip. I put the leather strap over the hammer to hold it in place and set out to explore the woods. After a little preparation with good insect repellent, tracking tucking my socks over my pants to keep ticks off, I also put rubber bands around my sleeves and I was off into the woods. I was very interested in hunting as I walked into the woods. I was looking for a place to unwind. I wasn't very interested in hunting as I walked into the woods. I was looking for a place to unwind. I think my wife knew that's what I was doing. She never complained about me not bringing home any game when I went hunting. As I walked off the hill, the elevation dropped about 50 foot at a time, and there were terraces about 100 foot wide, then another drop off. This repeated the pattern to the bottom of the hill. This was very helpful when climbing up the hill because you could rest on each terrace from the climb. As I started off the and over the top of the hill. The brush was very thick. There was a narrow trail that I followed going down the hill. In early spring, leaves and branches blocked much of your view. I pushed them out of the way as I walked down the hill for 2 or 3 terraces. That put me about half a mile away from my house. That was one of my favorite places. It had a huge rock, a boulder, which I liked to sit on. I loved to listen to the squirrels play in the tree as they chattered and fussed at each other. The trees, dressed in their new leaves, had taken on an especially bright green color. Many of the wildflowers were in bloom on the forest floor. The air always smelled fresh. The temperature was pleasant in early spring. I sat there for a good hour and a half watching wildlife, which I learned to ignore, or which had learned to ignore me by this time. It was so peaceful and quiet that it calmed your nerves and settled your mind. It was almost like therapy for me. Every Saturday morning, away from all the cares of life. By now, the rock had become uncomfortably hard. I didn't think my posterior would take it much longer. I gathered up my hat and strapped my holster back on and checked the pistol to make sure it was ready if I needed it for snakes. I started the slow, steady climb back to the house. As I walked along that little narrow path, my senses became attuned to the sounds of the wood, each bird making sounds to attract or discourage another bird. The noise of insects, the sound of squirrels rustling around in the leaves and in the trees. I thought how wonderfully bright all the colors matched together in this part of the woods where they had not been disturbed. The brain sees a gallery of blues and whites, all of the trees, the brush, and the flowers, each with a different color, highlighting the wonders of God's great creation. All of the animals were busy with the work they had to do in order to survive. You realized what a small part humans played in the world. I thought to myself, if we were gone, nothing would change in the woods. Each year, it would repeat the same pattern of beauty and wonder. As I walked along, slowly moving branches and limbs out of the way so that I could see further up the trail, I thought I heard a strange sound in the distance. This strange noise brought me back to the here and now, away from the thoughts of eternity and beauty and wonder. I began to pay more attention to the surroundings in greater detail. I began to be a little more on edge, wondering if perhaps I had heard another mountain lion or one of those Arkansas razorbacks I've heard so much about. They say a razorback has 2 sharp tusks, one sticking out of each side of its jaw. They say that those tusks were sharp as razors and could cut to the bone if they ever got hold of you. As I was walking along the trail, this small little sound became louder and more easily distinguishable. I had been around pigs long enough to know the sound that big boars make. It's an unmistakable sound, one that is a cross between a grunt and a growl. As I listened, I had to strain my ears to cut out all the other sounds of the forest, but I was sure what I was hearing was the noise of a wild razorback. All of a sudden, my mind focused on the man that I knew in town who had been attacked by one. He warned me to stay clear of any wild boars because they could kill you, he said. If they did, they certainly would try to eat you. As I thought on these things and listened for the sound that had caught my attention, began I became very focused. This noise was coming up from the trail from which I had just walked. I quickly turned myself around and began to back up the trail so I could After all, that is where the sound was coming from. I quickly reached down and unhooked the strap on my pistol so I could draw it out of the holster. As I backed up, I sighted down the barrel as I watched the trail for my movement, or any movement. I knew this 22 pistol would not kill a boar, but the noise it made might scare him off. I began to move more slowly now to so that I could not get so I would not get his attention. As I backed up the trail, I tested each step to make sure I had good footing and that I would not fall. My attention was back down the trail. I took each step very slowly. Sometimes I moved my left hand behind me to feel where I was going. I might quickly glance around to see where the trail went in relation to where I stood. I started measuring my breath, causing it to slow down so that I could hear more clearly the sound of this wild boar. I was sure it was coming toward me. The sound became more pronounced. I could hear a long, low growl, that sound growing slightly louder with each 2 or 3 seconds that passed. I took maybe 2 more steps. I grew very still because even my walking backward was making noise. It was interfering with my ability to hear this faint sound, even though the sound was not very loud. I could tell it was out in front of me and moving toward me. At this point, I became positive that I knew what was I was hearing. In fact, a wild boar coming up the trail toward me. I braced myself as I heard it drawing much closer. I steadied my pistol's grip and I leveled the barrel down the hill just a little so that when he came into view, I would already have a bead on him. Now the sound seemed very loud, and I could hear something else in the woods besides this grunting noise. I thought to myself, I wished I had my rifle instead of this pistol because that would be less fearful. I then began to think, do the best you can with what you've got. I took a deep breath and held it. The blood rushed to my head. I held, I had, I could feel my pulse in my neck. I could also feel bite, every beat, sorry, every beat of my heart on my eardrums. I remembered that's what I felt like when I thought the mountain lion was stalking us last winter. Now the sound is very near, but it wasn't on the ground. I wondered what it could be because I knew pigs do not fly. Just at that moment, some movement caught my eye. I turned and looked. No, this was not a flying pig, and it was nothing that could hurt me. What had caught my eye was a creature of great beauty and well beloved by many, and I had watched them many times before. No, this was nothing to fear from this creature. It fears it fears us more than we would ever fear it. It was beautiful, a beautiful little hummingbird that had brought such fear to me. It had prompted me to raise my gun and prepare to kill. It really was a beautiful little creature. I calmed down immediately as I let out my breath. My heart slowed to a normal pace and my breath resumed. The amazing thing is how quickly I thought the worst, and for all the rejuvenation that I had received sitting out in the woods and relaxing and recharging my batteries, had been so quickly taken away by fear. As the blood went back to my extremities after having rushed to my head, I felt a throbbing at almost as loud as the night I had feared the most, as the might I had feared the most. I took a deep breath, hoping to calm my nerves, and it did. I thought how embarrassing it would have been if someone had been with me and witnessed this overreaction to a small hummingbird going about his business in the woods. I just sat right there on the trail and spent the next few minutes thinking about what had happened. I gave a little chuckle as I thought about how quickly reacted to things we are not even sure of. After about 5 minutes, I stood up and walked back home with my regular pace. As I came in the house, my wife Stephanie was at the door. She had seen me coming across the field. She asked, "Are you all right? Did anything happen?" I kind of smiled at her and didn't say anything. I walked into the living room and sat down in my easy chair. She followed me and sat down in her chair. I took a deep breath and laughed out loud. She asked, "What was so funny?" So I began to relate the story of that wild razorback that I had thought was about to eat me alive, how I had braced myself for killing one, how it was only a hummingbird making that grunting sound. I told her I felt about an inch tall, like a man using a cannon to hunt for a butterfly. I hope you enjoyed this story. There's funny stories along with heartbreaking stories that happened in my life, and that's one of the funny ones. I hope you enjoyed it. God bless you, and keep up